There is a rock in the Pacific Ocean, a little more than a mile off the coast of Oregon, that has no business having anything built on it at all. It is a lump of black basalt, less than an acre across, rising almost 100 feet straight up out of some of the most violent water on the American coast, with no beach, no harbor, no landing, nothing but sheer wet stone, and the sea smashing against it day and night. And on top of that rock, in the year 1881, men finished building a lighthouse. They blasted the head off the rock to make a place to stand. They hauled every stone and brick and beam and drop of fresh water out through the surf, and they raised a tower that threw its light 130 feet above the sea, on a stone so hostile that the light keepers who would live there gave it a name that stuck. They called it Terrible Tilly, and before a single stone of it was ever laid, the rock had already killed a man. The first thing the government needed was a survey, someone to land on that rock and measure it, and say whether a lighthouse could even be put there. The man they sent was a master mason named John Trewavas, an experienced lighthouse builder who had worked on some of the hardest sites in England. He came out on a boat. He reached for a handhold on the eastern face of the rock, in the surging water, and he missed his footing. The sea took him in an instant and never gave him back. His body was never found. And here is the part that stops me. After watching a man die just trying to touch the rock, they built the lighthouse anyway. I want to tell you the whole story, because it is one of the most extraordinary and forgotten feats of American engineering, and the men who did it deserve to be remembered. The mason who drowned was named John Trewavas. The superintendent who took over and somehow got the thing built was named Charles Ballantyne. And the quarrymen who lived on that rock through the storms, most of their names the records did not keep, though they did something almost beyond belief. If you care about the men who built this country with their hands, the workers nobody ever wrote a book about, please subscribe to Global Old History right now. Hit the button, come back. Start with why anyone would even try, because you do not build the most expensive lighthouse on the West Coast on a killer rock a mile out to sea unless the need is desperate. And on this stretch of the Oregon coast, the need was as desperate as it gets. The waters here, from the Oregon shore up past the mouth of the Columbia River, have a name among sailors, and the name is the Graveyard of the Pacific. Over the years, this coast and the terrible sandbar at the mouth of the Columbia have swallowed something like 2,000 ships and more than 1,000 human lives. The Columbia Bar alone, where the great river meets the ocean in a chaos of shifting sand and colliding currents, has claimed hundreds of documented wrecks. Ships came in from across the whole Pacific, loaded with cargo and crew, felt their way toward the river in the fog, and simply disappeared onto the sand and the rocks. And there was no good light to guide them in. So in 1878, Congress set aside $50,000 for a first-class lighthouse to mark the approach. And the engineers looked at the coast, and their eyes fell on that black rock a mile offshore, standing right where a light would do the most good. It was the perfect place to put a lighthouse. It was also very nearly an impossible place to build one. To understand why they would spend a fortune and a man's life on that rock, you have to picture what was actually happening out there in the dark. This was the main sea gate to the whole Pacific Northwest. Ships came in from San Francisco, from Hawaii, from across the ocean, heavy with cargo and crowded with people, all of them trying to find the narrow, shifting, deadly entrance to the Columbia River in weather that is foggy and wild for much of the year. A captain feeling his way toward that coast at night, with no light to steer by, was gambling his ship and every soul aboard on dead reckoning and luck. And the luck ran out constantly. Ships piled onto the bar, and the rocks year after year, and the wrecks were not distant statistics to the people of that coast. They were bodies on the beach, and cargo rolling in the surf, and new widows in the little towns. A good light on that rock would not be a convenience. It would be, quite literally, the difference between a ship coming home and a ship never being heard from again. That was the prize that could justify the risk. Because the rock itself is a fortress with no gate. It is basalt, hard as iron, worn smooth and steep by the endless sea. There is no cove, no shelf, no gentle side. The Pacific swells roll in from thousands of miles of open ocean and break against it with a force that can throw water clear over the top, 100 feet up. To land on it, in the 1870s, you had to bring a boat in close to that heaving stone, time the swell, and jump for a handhold, which is exactly what killed John Trewavas. He was 38 years old. He had built lighthouses in the worst places England had to offer, and the rock took him on the survey, before the real work had even begun. The news of his death ran up and down the coast. and the reaction of ordinary people was simple and reasonable. This is madness. Leave the rock alone. No lighthouse is worth this. It is worth staying with John Trewavas for a moment, because he was no reckless amateur. He was a master mason from a world of lighthouse builders, a man who had worked on the Wolf Rock Light off the coast of Cornwall, one of the most feared offshore building sites in all of Britain. If anyone alive knew how to land on a savage rock in a heavy sea, it was him. That is what makes his death so sobering. When the survey party came out to the rock in the autumn of 1879, it was Trewavas, the expert, who went to make the landing, because he was the man most likely to do it safely. He watched the swell, he chose his moment, he reached for the rock, and the ocean simply took him, faster than anyone could move. A man with him went into the water trying to reach him and very nearly drowned as well, and had to be hauled back half dead. And of Trewavas himself there was nothing, no body, no trace, only the empty heaving water where a moment before there had been a man. If the sea could kill him, the best there was, on a day calm enough to attempt a survey, then everyone up and down that coast understood exactly what building here was going to mean. But the government did not leave the rock alone, and that left Charles Ballantyne with one of the strangest problems any construction superintendent ever faced. He had to hire men to go work on the rock that had just publicly drowned the last man who touched it, in a region where everyone had heard the story. No local man in his right mind would take the job, so Ballantyne did something a little ruthless and a little brilliant. He found a crew of quarrymen who had come from far enough away that they had not heard about Trewavas, hired them before they could hear, and then kept them sequestered, cut off from the gossip of the coast, until they were committed and out on the water, and it was too late to quit. It is not a comfortable story, but it is the reason the lighthouse exists. Sometimes the only way to get an impossible thing done is to get the workers past the point of no return before they have time to be sensible about it. Quick pause. If these stories matter to you, join the Boss tier for $4.99 a month. Loyalty badge, custom emoji, early access 24 hours before public, and members-only polls. Link in the description. Now back to it. And then came the landing, which was its own ordeal every single time. There was no way to simply step onto the rock. Instead, they rigged a line from a ship to the rock and ran a breeches buoy along it, which is a life ring with a pair of canvas trousers sewn into it, hung from a pulley on a rope. A man would climb into the breeches buoy, and then he would be hauled out over the heaving sea, dangling from a rope strung between a pitching ship and a wet black rock, with the swells surging beneath his feet, and swung across and dropped onto the stone. Every man, every tool, every sack of provisions came onto that rock the same way, flying through the air on a rope over the Pacific. Just getting to work in the morning was an act of courage that would make most of us turn around and go home. And it was not a thing you did once and got used to. It was the commute. Every day the weather allowed a landing at all. Think about what that ride was actually like. You are lowered off the deck of a ship that is rolling in an ocean swell into a canvas seat hung from a single rope, and then you are hauled out along that rope, swaying and spinning, over water that heaves up toward your boots and drops away again, cold and gray and bottomless. The rope sags in the middle, so that at the lowest point the sea reaches up for you. If the line parted, or the ship lurched at the wrong instant, or your grip failed, there was nothing beneath you but the same Pacific that had already killed the best mason in the business. And then the rock comes up hard and wet in front of you and you are dropped onto it, and now you belong to it until the buoy takes you back. Every man on that crew did that, out and back, just to reach the job, on a rock most people would not set foot on for any wage on earth. Once they were on the rock, they had to survive on it, and there was nowhere to live. So the first thing they did was cut a shallow niche into the northeast side of the rock, the most sheltered face, and bolt a small timber shanty into it, a wooden shack pinned to the stone and covered over with canvas, and that was home. Men lived in that shanty on a bare, wet rock in the middle of the ocean, through the winter, with the surf exploding against the stone a few feet away, and the whole shelter shuddering with every wave. There was no escape if the weather turned. There was no boat that could take them off in a real storm. When the sea was up, they were prisoners of the rock, and they simply had to endure whatever the Pacific decided to do to them. There is a particular kind of courage in simply staying. A soldier in a battle at least gets to move, to act, to fight back. The men on Tillamook Rock could do nothing at all against the thing that threatened them. When a storm came up in the night, they lay in a wooden shanty bolted to a rock in the middle of the ocean and listened to the waves hit, each one a blow you could feel through the stone, water bursting over the shelter and streaming down the canvas, the whole world reduced to noise and cold, and the shuddering of the rock. They could not leave. They could not fight it. They could only lie there and hope the bolts held and the shanty did not go into the sea the way the storehouse eventually would. Night after night of that, in the dark, wet and afraid, with the nearest safe ground a mile of impossible water away. And in the morning, if they were still there, they got up and went back to work. I am not sure I have the words for what that took. And what the Pacific decided to do to them, first, was try to starve them off. The lighthouse could not be built on the rounded top of the rock, because there was no level ground up there, so the crew's first great task was to remove the top of the rock itself. They chipped and chiseled and blasted away the upper 30 feet of solid basalt, by hand and with black powder, to carve out a level platform some 90 feet above the sea where the tower and its buildings could stand. It was brutal, dangerous work, blasting the head off a rock while you were standing on it, in the wind and the spray, and in the middle of it, in January of 1880, a huge winter gale came down on them and tore the crew's storehouse right off the rock and flung it into the sea, and with it went much of their food and shelter. The men were marooned out there, cut off, running out of provisions, for something like 16 days, while storm after storm hammered the rock and no boat could get near them. They came very close to dying on that stone, of cold and hunger, before the weather finally broke and relief could reach them. And when it did, they went back to blasting. By the 1st of May 1880, against everything the ocean had thrown at them, they had their level platform. Sit with those 16 days for a moment, because they are the low point of the whole story and the true measure of the men. The gale had taken their storehouse and much of their food into the sea. They were a small crew on a bare rock a mile offshore in the dead of an Oregon winter, and the ocean would not let a single boat come near them to bring help. So they rationed what little they had left, and they waited, and the storms kept coming, and the days went by, one after another, with no relief and the food running down toward nothing. They had every reason to believe they might die out there, slowly, of cold and hunger, within sight of a shore they could not reach. And when the weather finally broke and a boat could get a line to them and pass across some food, they did not demand to be taken off the rock for good, which is what very nearly anyone would have done. They restocked, and they stayed, and they picked their tools back up and went on blasting the head off the rock. That is the crew that built Terrible Tilly. Before I tell you what happened next, do me a favor and subscribe. The algorithm buries old industry stories unless enough people click. One click, come back. Then they had to build the tower, and every ounce of it had to come from the mainland, out through the surf, up on the breech's buoy and the derrick, cut stone for the walls, brick, timber, iron, cement, the great lens for the light. And, because a bare rock in the ocean has no fresh water at all, every single drop of drinking water the men used had to be carried out to them from shore, piece by piece, load by load, swinging through the air over the sea. The tower went up, a squat, immensely strong structure of stone designed to take the full fury of the Pacific and keep a light burning at the top of it. When it was finished, the focal plane of the light stood 133 feet above the sea, and the whole thing had cost more than $123,000, an enormous sum for the day, which made Terrible Tilly the most expensive lighthouse ever built on the West Coast. Every dollar of it, and every stone, had been fought out of the ocean the hard way. And the tower they raised was not only strong, it was smart, because it had to survive an enemy that never rested. The walls were built low and immensely thick, hunkered down on the leveled rock, shaped to take the shock of water that could and did break clear over the top of the whole structure. Attached to the tower were the keeper's quarters and the workrooms, all of it engineered as a single low fortress against the sea. And at the very top sat the reason for all of it, a great first-order Fresnel lens, the largest and finest class of lighthouse lens ever made, a beehive of hand-ground glass prisms that gathered the flame of an oil lamp and bent it into a single powerful beam that could be seen far out across the water. That lens was the jewel the whole rock had been conquered to hold up. Everything else, the blasting, the drowning, the marooning, the years of hauling stone through the surf, all of it existed to lift that one lamp high enough and hold it steady enough that a captain lost in the fog off the Columbia might catch its flash and live. When you remember what it cost, the light itself becomes almost unbearably precious. And then, In one of the cruelest coincidences in the whole story, the sea reminded everyone exactly why the light was needed, at the worst possible moment. In the first days of January 1881, with the lighthouse nearly complete but not yet lit, a sailing ship called the Lupatia came feeling her way through the fog toward the Columbia in the dark. The men working on the rock heard voices out in the mist, shouts, the sounds of a ship in trouble, terribly close. They could do nothing. The light was not yet burning, and in the fog and the night the Lupatia struck near the rock and went down, and all 16 of her crew were lost. The only survivor was the ship's dog, found alive on the beach the next day. The lighthouse that was built to prevent exactly that kind of tragedy watched it happen at its own feet, days before its lamp was lit. On the 21st of January 1881, just after that disaster, the light of Terrible Tilly finally shone out over the graveyard of the Pacific for the first time. It had come, for the Lupatia, a few days too late. There is a hard lesson buried in that wreck, and the men on the rock felt it more sharply than anyone. For 2 years they had fought the ocean for this light, given a life for it, nearly died for it, and then in the last days before it could be lit, the very disaster it was built to prevent happened close enough for them to hear the drowning men cry out in the fog. It must have made every stone they had hauled and every night they had shivered on that rock feel at once completely justified and unbearably cruelly late. That is what they were working against out there. Not an abstraction, voices in the dark, going silent. For the next 76 years that light burned, and men lived out on the rock to keep it burning, and their lives were their own kind of ordeal. The lighthouse was manned by a team of keepers, 4 of them in the early years, and duty on Tillamook Rock was considered some of the hardest in the entire lighthouse service. They were a mile out to sea on a bare stone, cut off from the world, their only fast link to shore an underwater telegraph cable. Supplies that were supposed to come regularly could be delayed for days or weeks when the sea would not allow a landing. The isolation wore on men. The endless noise of the surf, the shuddering of the tower in the storms, the sheer confinement of a rock you could walk across in a minute, all of it worked on the mind. Keepers came and went, some of them broken by the place, and the nickname the service gave it, Terrible Tilly, was not affectionate. It was a warning. The work itself never got any easier. Even after the building was finished, everything still had to come and go by that same derrick and breeches buoy, which meant that a keeper rotating ashore, or a load of oil and food coming out, still ran the old gauntlet over the water every single time. Fresh water was caught off the roofs and stored in cisterns, and had to be guarded and rationed. Mail and news came when the sea allowed and not before. Men stood their watches through the long nights, tending the lamp, winding the heavy mechanism that turned the great lens, keeping the light alive hour after hour while the storms leaned on the tower. And the isolation did strange things to people. There are stories, hard now to separate from legend, of keepers who cracked under the loneliness and the noise and the endless confinement, who had to be taken off the rock as changed men. Whatever the exact truth of each tale, the plain fact underneath them is real enough. Living on Terrible Tilly asked more of ordinary human beings than almost any other posting in the service, and the men who did it, year after year, were quietly heroic in a way no one ever carved on a monument. One quick note, I turned the full story into a book, everything the records gave me. If you want it, the link is in the description. And the sea never stopped testing the tower. The most famous assault came on the 21st of October, 1934, when a storm of almost unimaginable violence struck the rock, with winds clocked around 109 miles an hour. The waves did not just wash over the lighthouse. They picked up boulders, chunks of the rock itself, and hurled them 100 feet into the air, through the glass of the lantern room at the very top of the tower. The great lens, the heart of the light, was smashed to pieces. The sea tore out iron bolts that had been anchored 3 feet deep into solid rock. Water and stone and broken glass and dead fish came pouring down the inside of the tower, flooding it, and the keepers had to climb up into the rafters to keep their heads above the water rising inside their own lighthouse. That the tower survived that night at all, that it did not simply come apart and vanish into the sea with everyone in it, is a testament to how well the men of 1880 had built it, out of stone hauled through the surf, on a rock that had killed a man before they ever began. And 1934 was only the most famous of the beatings. Over its long life, the tower was struck again and again, its windows broken, its rooms flooded, rock and water driven against it and over it by storm after storm, so that keeping the light going was never just a matter of tending a lamp. It was the constant repair of a building that the ocean was constantly trying to take apart. Every winter was a siege. The sea would rest through the calm months and then come back, and the men on the rock would batten down and endure it, and then crawl out afterward to fix what had been smashed and light the lamp again. For 76 years that went on, a slow, grinding war between one stubborn stone tower and the entire Pacific Ocean, and for 76 years the tower did not lose. I think about what a modern engineer sees when he looks at Terrible Tilly, because his reaction is close to disbelief. He sees a first-class lighthouse built on a sheer basalt rock in the open Pacific, a mile from shore, with no harbor and no landing, using nothing but rope and derrick and mussel and black powder. He sees a crew that removed 30 feet off the top of a solid rock by hand to make a place to build. He sees men who survived being marooned and half-starved by a winter gale and then simply went back to work. He sees a tower engineered so soundly that it took a direct hit from boulders thrown by the ocean and stood. And he sees, at the very beginning of it all, the drowning of John Trewavis, the one life the project cost, paid before the first stone was even placed, as if the rock had demanded a price up front. If you handed that whole brief to the best firm in the world today, build a lighthouse on that rock, out there, by hand, they would tell you to find another rock. And the men of 1880 did not have another rock. They had that one, and the ships were dying on the bar, and so they built. The light went dark at last in 1957 when the Coast Guard decided the cost and the danger of keeping men out on that rock were no longer worth it, and replaced Terrible Tilly with an automatic buoy bobbing in the water nearby. The keepers came off the rock for the last time, and the lighthouse that had cost a man his life to survey, and a fortune to build, and 76 years of human endurance to run, was simply switched off and left to the sea. It still stands out there, empty, battered, its lantern dark, a mile off the Oregon coast, and in a strange final chapter it now serves as a columbarium, a resting place for the ashes of the dead, so that the loneliest rock on the coast is not entirely unpopulated after all. The rock has passed through private hands since then, bought and sold. Its lonely tower turned to that strange new purpose, and for most of the year it belongs now to the birds. Seabirds nest by the thousands on the ledges the workmen once blasted and clung to, and the whole rock is part of a protected wildlife refuge, off limits, unreachable, left to the surf and the gulls. You can see it from the Oregon shore on a clear day, a small pale tower on a black rock out in the swell, and almost no one looking at it has any idea what it took to put it there. That a man drowned before the first stone was cut, that a crew nearly starved to death on that stone rather than give it up, that men lived out there for 3 generations keeping a light so strangers could find their way home. From the beach it looks almost peaceful. It was never peaceful, not for one single day of its working life. That is the thing I want to leave you with. We tend to think of a lighthouse as a gentle thing, a friendly light on a hill, a postcard. Terrible Tilly was never that. It was one of the hardest, bravest, most dangerous pieces of engineering ever attempted on this continent, built out of desperation to stop the drowning of sailors, on a rock that drowned a man just for being surveyed. John Trewavis gave his life reaching for it. Charles Ballantyne tricked and drove a crew of quarrymen into building it. Those quarrymen blasted the top off a rock in the ocean, survived a gale that nearly starved them, and hauled a stone tower up out of the sea by rope, and then keepers lived out there for 3 generations tending a light so that other men they would never meet could find their way home in the dark. And we have almost entirely forgotten them. But the rock is still out there. The tower they built is still standing, after everything the Pacific has thrown at it for a century and a half. And think about what kind of monument it really is. Most great works are built to make something possible, a bridge to cross, a building to fill, a fortune to take. This one was built for no reason at all, but to save the lives of strangers, people the builders would never meet, sailors not yet born, who would one day come feeling toward that coast in the dark and catch a flash of light on a black rock and turn away in time. Every soul that made it safely past the Columbia Bar for 76 years because of that light owed a small, unknowing debt to a drowned mason and a crew of half-starved quarrymen. The men on the rock never knew whose lives they had saved. The saved never knew who had paid for it. That is about the purest kind of good work there is. That is worth remembering. That is worth saying out loud. One more thing. If you want to be part of the inner circle on this channel, join Final Boss for $9.99 a month. Public shout-out in upcoming videos, members-only investigations, plus everything from Boss tier. Link in description. See you in the next one.